Cassidy Lane knew what they called her. The ugly one, the stray, the girl with the mismatched eyes and the face that could curdle milk. She'd heard it whispered in every town she'd been run out of, every saloon she'd been denied work in. But hunger had a way of shouting down shame, and right now, her hunger was screaming. So she kept walking, dust coating her tongue, the Wyoming sun a hammer against her skull. She walked toward a rumor, a place called the Broken Star Ranch. It was run by a man they called the Iron Rancher, Jed Mallister. A man, they said, who was harder than the land he worked. A man who'd buried 2 wives and maybe even his own brother. A man who hired anyone who wasn't afraid of work and didn't ask questions. Cassidy had nothing left but work, and she'd forgotten how to ask questions long ago. When she finally saw the wooden arch of the ranch, her legs nearly gave out. The place was quiet. Too quiet. A figure moved by the barn, broad-shouldered and deliberate. It had to be him. Jed Mallister was bigger than the stories, a giant carved from oak and silence. A pale scar snaked down his temple, and his eyes were the color of whiskey right before the fire hits. Cassidy's throat went dry. "Sir," she croaked, her voice rusty, "I'm looking for work. I can cook. I can clean." He didn't even turn all the way. He just sized her up, his gaze as flat and unforgiving as the plains. "I ain't hiring." The words were a gunshot, the end of the line. Hope, what little she had, withered and died right there in the dust. She nodded, ready to turn, ready for the long walk to nowhere. But then something inside her, a tiny stubborn ember, refused to go out. "Sir," she said, louder this time. He paused, his back still to her. "I know I ain't much to look at," she stammered, the words tasting like ash. "Folks have made that clear. But I can cook." The silence stretched, pulled thin by the wind. She could feel her face burning with shame. He was going to laugh, or worse, just walk away. Then, slow as a sunrise, he set down the sack of feed he was carrying. He still didn't turn around. "Can you make biscuits that rise?" he asked, his voice a low gravel. Cassidy blinked. It was the last question she ever expected. "Yes, sir, and gravy, and beans." "I've lived on beans," she added, a sliver of courage in her voice. He finally turned, his face shadowed by his hat, impossible to read. He looked at her for a long moment, a moment that felt like a lifetime. Then he gave a single sharp nod. "Kitchen's round back. You can stay, but don't touch the horses." He walked off without another word. Cassidy stood there, dizzy with relief, the dust swirling around her boots. She hadn't just been hired, she'd been chosen. But as she watched him disappear into the barn, a cold thought slithered into her mind. Why the strange question about biscuits? And why, under any circumstances, was she forbidden from touching the horses? Something was wrong here. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just a job. It was a test. And she had a terrible feeling she was about to find out what happened if she failed. The kitchen was a small, sturdy box of sun-baked logs, but to Cassidy, it felt like a cathedral. It smelled of old coffee and smoked wood, the scent of purpose. She found flour, salt, and lard, and her hands began to move on their own, a rhythm she knew better than her own name. Kneading, rolling, shaping. With every push of the dough, she pushed away the memory of the pity in people's eyes. She wasn't a stray anymore. She was a cook. Outside, she could hear the ranch hands, their laughter rough and careless. "Hey, new lady!" one of them yelled. "You married?" Another snickered. Cassidy's hands froze on the dough. She stayed silent, her back to the door. Then Jed's voice cut through the air, sharp as a razor. "Get back to work!" The laughter died instantly. Cassidy's heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear but with a strange, foreign feeling. He had defended her. No one had ever defended her. When the biscuits were golden brown and the beans were thick, she set the table. Jed came in first, taking his seat at the head without a word. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if every bite was a decision. Cassidy busied herself at the stove, her nerves stretched tight. "These are good," he grunted, not looking up. The words were so unexpected, she almost dropped the coffee pot. "Thank you, sir." "You can stay," he said, his voice flat. "Cot in the storeroom." That night, she couldn't sleep. The storeroom was small, but it was hers. It was more than she'd had in years, but her mind kept circling back to his strange rules. Don't touch the horses. Why? What could be so special about them? The next morning, she rose before the sun, the routine a comfort. She had breakfast ready when the men shuffled in. Jed entered last, a walking shadow against the dawn. He ate, nodded once, and left. The silence he commanded was absolute. The other men called her Miss Lane, their voices still blunt, but the taunts were gone. They feared him more than they disliked her. Days bled into one another. Morning biscuits, noon beans, evening silence. Cassidy found a rhythm, a fragile peace. But the question about the horses gnawed at her. The stables were right next to the main barn, but Jed always tended to them himself, his movements almost secretive. One afternoon, driven by a curiosity she couldn't suppress, she crept toward the stable while Jed was out mending a far fence line. The door was barred with a heavy wooden plank. Peeking through a crack in the warped wood, she saw them. They weren't work horses. They were magnificent, sleek animals, their coats gleaming like polished jet. But that wasn't what made her breath catch in her throat. In the far stall, almost hidden in the shadows, stood a single, pure white mare. And tied to its saddle, old and worn, was a small, faded blue ribbon, the kind a little girl might wear in her hair. Suddenly, she heard the crunch of boots on gravel behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Jed stood there, his face a thundercloud. His eyes weren't just angry, they were filled with a terrifying, bottomless grief. "I told you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "not to touch the horses." Cassidy backed away, her hands raised. I'm sorry, I just—" But he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring at the stable, at the white mare, as if seeing a ghost. She realized then that the horses weren't just animals to him. They were a memory, a shrine, and she had just desecrated holy ground. The stories about his 2 dead wives came rushing back, and a horrifying thought took root in her mind. What if the horses belonged to them? What if he wasn't just a man in mourning? What if he was a man guarding a tomb? Jed didn't fire her. That was almost worse. He just stopped speaking to her altogether. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt like a judgment. He'd look through her as if she were glass. The other men, sensing the shift, grew bolder. The taunts returned, sharper this time. "Looks like the boss is tired of his ugly pet," one of them sneered at supper. Cassidy kept her head down, her hands clenched in her lap, the shame burning hot in her cheeks. She expected Jed to say something, to shut them down like before. But he just kept eating, his face a mask of stone. It was a punishment, she knew, a deliberate, cruel lesson. The isolation was a physical weight. She started talking to herself in the kitchen, just to hear a voice. She thought about leaving, about taking her chances on the road again. But where would she go? And a stubborn part of her refused to be broken. She would earn her place. She would prove she was more than her face, more than her mistake. One night, a storm rolled in, the kind that tried to tear the sky apart. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind screamed like a banshee. Cassidy lay on her cot, listening to the fury, when she heard a sound over the wind. A horse, screaming in terror. Without thinking, she grabbed a lantern and ran out into the maelstrom. The stable door had been blown open by the wind, banging against its frame. Inside, the horses were wild with fear. The white mare, in particular, was kicking at her stall, her eyes rolling. Lightning flashed, illuminating the chaos. Cassidy saw that a fallen beam was pinning the mare's leg. Jed was nowhere in sight. The men were holed up in the bunkhouse, likely too scared or too drunk to care. It was just her. "Don't touch the horses," his voice echoed in her head. But she couldn't just leave it to suffer. Taking a deep breath, she waded into the stall, whispering soft words, the way her father had taught her long ago. "Easy now, easy, girl." The mare thrashed, but Cassidy stood her ground, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. Slowly, carefully, she began to work at the beam, her hands raw against the splintered wood. It was heavy, impossibly heavy. Just when her strength was about to give out, another pair of hands joined hers. Jed. He'd appeared out of the rain like a phantom, his face soaked, his eyes blazing. Together they heaved. The beam moved. The mare, freed, stumbled but stood. For a long moment they just stood there in the lantern light, breathing heavily, the storm raging around them. Rain dripped from his hat. He looked at her, then at the mare, then back at her. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by a stunned confusion. "You—" he started, then stopped. He didn't understand. The town called her ugly. His men called her a stray. Yet here she was, risking her life for an animal he had forbidden her from even looking at. He reached out, his rough fingers brushing a piece of straw from her hair. The touch was electric, a jolt that ran straight through her. "Why?" he whispered, his voice hoarse over the wind. "Because it was the right thing to do," she whispered back. The simplicity of her answer seemed to break something in him. The stone mask crumbled, and for a split second, she saw the raw grief he kept locked away. He looked like a man drowning in a sea of his own making. The storm wasn't just outside, it was inside him too, and in that moment she knew with absolute certainty that the stories about him were all wrong. He wasn't a monster, he was a prisoner. But a prisoner of what? The truce between them was unspoken. The next morning, the storm was gone, and the silence had changed again. It was no longer a punishment, but a space they shared. He started talking to her, not much, just a word here and there. "Mornin'. Coffee's good." Each word was a small stone dropped into a deep well, the ripples spreading further than he knew. Cassidy learned to read his moods by the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. She learned that he took his coffee black, that he hated the smell of onions, and that he sometimes stood by the fence at dusk, just staring at the horizon as if waiting for someone who was never coming back. The whispers from town, however, didn't stop. When a ranch hand went in for supplies, he came back with fresh gossip. "They're saying Mallister's gone mad," he announced at the dinner table. "Taken up with that ugly woman 'cause he can't find a real one." Cassidy flinched, but before the man could continue, Jed's fist hit the table with a crack like thunder. Plates jumped. The men froze. "Get out," Jed snarled, his eyes dark with a rage she hadn't seen since the night she'd gone to the stables. "All of you, get out." The men scrambled from their chairs and fled, leaving Cassidy alone with him in the ringing silence. He didn't look at her. He just stood there, his hands clenched, his whole body radiating a cold fury. "You shouldn't listen to them," he said, his voice tight. "What if they're right?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. He finally turned to her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "They ain't," he said. The conviction in his voice shook her. He saw something in her that no one else had, something she couldn't even see in herself. That night, she found him in the newly repaired stable, gently brushing the white mare's coat. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face. She stood in the doorway, content to watch. Her name was Lily, he said suddenly, without turning around. Cassidy's breath caught. "My daughter." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. She loved this horse more than anything. The ribbon. It was hers. Now she understood. The mare wasn't a memory of a wife. It was the last living piece of his child. What happened to her? Cassidy asked softly, stepping into the stable. He finally turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes was a raw, open wound. Fire, he said, his voice cracking. There was a fire. My wife, Maria, and Lily. They were trapped. He touched the scar on his temple. I tried to get to them. I tried. He didn't have to finish. The story was written all over his face. He wasn't the man who had buried 2 wives. He was the man who had lost everything. He told her about Maria, his second wife, a woman full of life and laughter. He even told her about his first wife, Alara, who had left him years ago, unable to handle the harshness of ranch life. She hadn't died. She'd just walked away. The town had twisted his grief into something monstrous, and he had let them. It was easier to be feared than to be pitied. He had built walls around himself, and for the first time, Cassidy was seeing through them. "I'm so sorry, Jed," she whispered. He just shook his head, a single tear tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. He looked at her, his guard completely down. "You're the first person I've told." The confession changed everything. A bond formed between them, forged in shared silence and quiet understanding. He started leaving her small gifts, a wildflower on the kitchen windowsill, a new, sharper knife for her vegetables, a horseshoe nailed above her door for luck. They were small things, but they spoke volumes. The ranch began to feel less like a refuge and more like a home. But peace on the plains is a fragile thing. One afternoon, a dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Riders. 4 of them. Jed saw them too, and his body went rigid. "Get inside, Cassidy," he said, his voice low and urgent as he reached for the rifle he kept mounted by the door. "Bolt the door and don't come out." "Who is it?" she asked, her heart starting to pound. "Trouble," was all he said, his eyes fixed on the approaching figures. She did as she was told, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy bolt into place. Peeking through the window, she saw the riders pull up. The man in the lead was tall and lean, with a cruel twist to his mouth. He looked eerily like Jed, but where Jed's face was carved with grief, this man's was etched with malice. He dismounted, a confident swagger in his step. "Hello, brother," the man called out, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you miss me?" Cassidy's blood ran cold. This wasn't just trouble. This was the brother Jed was supposed to have shot, and he was back. "Caleb!" Jed's voice was flat, betraying no emotion. But Cassidy, watching from the window, could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his knuckles were white on the rifle stock. This was the ghost from the darkest corner of his past, made flesh. "I heard you were dead," Jed said. Caleb laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that scraped the air. "You've been hearing what you want to hear for years, Jedediah, just like you wanted to hear that Pa left you the ranch because you were the better man." He spat on the ground. "He left it to you because you were weak. He knew you'd never leave. He knew you were too scared." Every word was a poisoned dart, aimed to wound. Cassidy could see Jed flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. "What do you want, Caleb?" "What do I want?" Caleb spread his arms wide, a gesture of mock disbelief. "I want what's mine. I want this land. I want the sweat and blood our father poured into it. The legacy you let rot, while you mourned a woman and a child you couldn't even save." The cruelty was breathtaking. He was twisting Jed's deepest grief into a weapon against him. This wasn't about a ranch. This was about hate, pure and simple. "The fire," Jed choked out the words. "That was you." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of a truth he had probably known, deep down, for years. Caleb's smile was chilling. "An accident. I just wanted to scare you. Send a message. I didn't know Maria and the girl were inside, but then you always did have bad luck." He shrugged, as if discussing the weather. So here's the deal. You sign the deed over to me, and you and your new pet can walk away. I might even let you live. Cassidy felt a surge of rage so fierce it stole her breath. He wasn't just threatening Jed, he was threatening her home. Jed's rifle came up, the barrel leveled at Caleb's chest. You get off my land. Caleb just laughed again. Your land? You see, the folks in town are tired of you, brother. They're tired of the big, silent rancher who thinks he's better than them. They've decided to back a winner. On cue, 2 more riders appeared over the ridge, then 2 more. And leading them was the sneering face of the town sheriff. They were completely, utterly surrounded. The town hadn't just gossiped, they had conspired. Jed's isolation hadn't been an accident, it had been a strategy. They had slowly, methodically cut him off from the world, so that when Caleb came, there would be no one to help. It's over, Jed, Caleb said, his voice triumphant. This ranch is mine. But he'd underestimated one thing. He'd underestimated the woman in the kitchen, the ugly stray, the one no one ever saw coming. Cassidy looked from the rifle in Jed's hand to the pot of beans simmering on the stove. She looked at the heavy iron skillet hanging by the hearth. They thought she was a victim, a pet. They had no idea who she really was. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. They weren't going to take this place. Not without the fight of their lives. Jed might have been ready to die for his past, but she was ready to live for their future. The first shot came from the sheriff. It wasn't aimed to kill, it was a warning shot, kicking up dust near Jed's feet. Don't be a fool, Mallister, the sheriff yelled. Sign the papers. Jed didn't move. He was a statue of defiance. This is my home, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. You'll take it from my dead hands. That can be arranged, Caleb snarled, raising his own pistol. Inside, Cassidy's mind worked with a desperate clarity. She couldn't fight them with guns, but she had other weapons. She grabbed the biggest, heaviest skillet. She stoked the fire until it roared, heating the lard in the pan until it was sizzling. She barricaded the back door with a heavy sack of flour. Then she waited. The standoff couldn't last. Caleb was getting impatient. Fine, he shouted. If you won't come out, we'll burn you out. One of his men dismounted, carrying a torch. He ran toward the house, intent on setting the porch ablaze. From his position, Jed couldn't get a clear shot, but Cassidy could. She kicked open the front door with all her might, screamed, and flung the skillet of boiling lard with a strength she didn't know she possessed. It hit the man square in the chest. He shrieked, dropping the torch and clawing at his blistering skin. The surprise attack created a moment of chaos. Jed seized it, firing a shot that splintered the rifle in another man's hands. Cassidy, get back! He roared. But she wasn't retreating. She scooped up the fallen man's rifle, her hands clumsy but determined. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but that didn't matter now. The fight exploded. It was no longer a standoff. It was a desperate, swirling battle. Gunsmoke filled the air, thick and acrid. The ranch hands who had stayed loyal to Jed, only 2 of them, fired from the bunkhouse, providing what little cover they could. Cassidy crouched behind the porch railing, the unfamiliar weight of the rifle in her hands. She fired, aiming not at a person, but at the ground near Caleb's horse. The animal reared, spooked, throwing Caleb to the dirt. Jed used the opening to charge, not with his gun, but with his fists. The 2 brothers crashed into each other, a raw, brutal explosion of years of pent-up hatred and grief. It was a fight of ghosts and memories, fists and dirt. The sheriff and his men, seeing their leader down, closed in on the house, their target now Cassidy. A bullet ripped through the wooden post beside her head, showering her with splinters. She ducked, her heart hammering. They were going to kill her. Then she heard a new sound, a sound that cut through the gunfire, a low, terrifying roar. It wasn't human. Over the ridge, a dark cloud was moving, fast. It wasn't a dust cloud, it was smoke. A massive prairie fire, driven by the wind, was bearing down on them all. Caleb, scrambling to his feet, saw it and laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. "If I can't have it, no one can," he screamed. He must have said it before he even arrived, a final, spiteful act of destruction. The wind shifted, and the fire front turned, a wall of orange and black roaring directly toward the ranch. The fight for the land was over. The fight for their lives had just begun. The fire was a living beast, devouring the dry grass with a deafening roar. Heat washed over the ranch in waves, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. Friend and foe were forgotten. There was only the fire. "The horses!" Jed screamed, breaking away from Caleb. He ran for the stables, Cassidy right behind him. The air was a choking haze of smoke and embers. Inside the stable, the animals were panicked, kicking at their stalls. Jed worked with a frantic urgency, unlatching doors, slapping rumps, driving the terrified animals out toward the already burnt pasture, the only safe ground. Cassidy went straight for the white mare, Lily's horse, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "It's okay, girl. It's okay." She led the mare out just as the stable roof began to groan, timbers cracking under the intense heat. Caleb and his men were in disarray. Their horses, panicked by the flames, scattered. The sheriff, his face pale with terror, was trying to mount his terrified horse. "It's every man for himself!" he shrieked, before galloping away, abandoning Caleb completely. Caleb stood alone in the yard, surrounded by the chaos he had created, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The fire was closing in, a pincer movement of flame that would soon engulf the entire ranch. "To the root cellar!" Jed yelled at Cassidy, grabbing her arm. It was their only chance, a hole in the ground to hide from the hell on earth, but Cassidy pulled away. "The house!" she cried. "The deed! Your father's letters!" All the history, the proof of Jed's ownership, was inside. He hesitated for only a second. The look on his face said it all. The land could burn, but he wouldn't lose his history, not again. Together, they ran into the house. Smoke was already pouring through the floorboards. Cassidy grabbed a wet cloth from a water bucket, pressing it to her face. While Jed wrestled with the strongbox where the papers were kept, Cassidy ran to the small bedroom. Tucked away in a drawer was a small tin box. She grabbed it, not knowing what was inside, only that Jed kept it by his bed, and that was enough. They stumbled out of the house just as the porch roof caught fire, a cascade of embers raining down around them. They made it to the heavy wooden doors of the root cellar, Jed clutching the strongbox, Cassidy holding the small tin one. They fell down the steps into the cool, damp darkness just as the world above them exploded in a firestorm. They huddled together in the dark, listening to the roar of the fire overhead. The sound was apocalyptic, the sound of the world ending. Smoke seeped through the cracks in the door, and the air grew thin. Cassidy coughed, her lungs burning. Jed put his arm around her, pulling her close. "Just breathe slow," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "It'll pass over." In the suffocating darkness, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the thundering of their hearts. Cassidy thought she was going to die. She thought of her life, a long road of hardship and loneliness, and how, in this one small corner of the world, she had finally found a place to stand. She had found a reason to fight. She wouldn't have traded it for anything. Hours seemed to pass. Slowly, gradually, the roaring above them began to subside, replaced by an eerie crackling and hissing. When they could no longer bear the smoke, Jed pushed against the heavy doors. They swung open to a scene of utter devastation. The world was black and gray. The house was a smoldering skeleton. The bunkhouse was gone. The new stable was a pile of ash. Everything was gone. Everything except the charred patch of land where the house used to be, and the two of them, standing in the middle of it, covered in soot. Cassidy looked at the devastation, her heart aching. But then she looked at Jed. He was looking at her, his face streaked with ash. his eyes full of a fierce, terrible gratitude. "You saved it," he said, nodding toward the tin box in her hands. "What is it?" she asked. He took it from her gently and opened it. Inside, nestled on a piece of worn velvet, were two things: a single, perfect photograph of his wife Maria and his daughter Lily, both smiling into the sun, and a small, tarnished silver locket. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "I was going to give it to Lily." Tears streamed down Cassidy's face, cutting clean paths through the soot. She had saved the only thing that truly mattered: his past, his heart. Suddenly, a figure staggered out of the haze. It was Caleb, his clothes burned, his face a mask of black soot, a terrible burn searing one side of his face. He stared at the ruins, his eyes empty. "It's all gone," he whispered, his voice a dead rasp. "It was never about the land for you, was it?" Jed said, his voice full of a strange, sad pity. "It was just about the hate." Caleb looked at his brother, and for the first time there was no malice in his eyes, only a hollow, echoing loss. The hate had burned him up from the inside out, and now it had consumed everything around him. He fell to his knees in the ash, a broken man in a broken world. The fire had taken everything, but it had also burned away the lies, leaving only the raw, painful truth. The rain came that night, a slow, steady drizzle that hissed on the hot ash and smelled of rebirth. They found the horses, safe in the burned-over fields. The two loyal ranch hands had survived by taking cover in a ditch. Caleb was gone, vanished into the gray dawn like a bad dream. Jed didn't try to stop him. The plains would be his prison now. As the sun rose on their ruined world, Cassidy stood beside Jed, looking at the black, empty space where their home had been. "What now?" she asked softly. Jed looked down at her mismatched eyes and soot-stained face. He saw not the ugly woman the world had named, but the fiercest, bravest soul he had ever known. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket. Without a word, he fastened it around her neck. "Now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we rebuild." He took her hand, his calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. And as they stood there, surrounded by the ruins, they weren't two broken people in a wasteland. They were the seeds of a new beginning, waiting for the sun. The Broken Star Ranch was gone, but for the first time, neither of them was truly alone. They started with the well. The fire had spared it, a deep, cool promise in the heart of the devastation. For weeks, they worked from sunup to sundown. The two remaining ranch hands, quiet and loyal, worked alongside them. They cleared debris, their movements slow and somber. They salvaged what they could: a few charred tools, a handful of warped pans, the iron frame of a bed. Each object was a ghost of a life that was. Cassidy cooked over an open fire, making do with what little they had. The food was simple, but it was hot, and it was shared. The four of them would eat in silence as the sun set, the sky a brilliant bruised purple over the blackened land. There was a bond between them now, a silent understanding that only comes from surviving the end of the world together. Jed was different. The fire had burned away the hard shell he had worn for so long. The silence was still there, but it was a comfortable, shared silence now. He talked more about his father, about growing up on the ranch. He told her stories about Lily, how she'd loved the smell of rain, and how she'd believed the stars were holes in the floor of heaven. He was sharing his memories, entrusting them to her piece by piece. One evening, as she was washing their tin plates in a bucket, he came and stood beside her. He took the plate from her hand and set it aside. "Cassidy," he said, his voice quiet. He had never used her first name before. It sounded strange and wonderful. He took her hands, turning them over to look at her palms. They were calloused and scarred from the work, from the fire. They told me I was a monster, he said, looking at her hands, not her face, and they told you that you were ugly. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and his whiskey-colored eyes were clear and deep. I reckon they were wrong about both of us. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of quiet reverence. It was a kiss that tasted of soot and sorrow, of survival and second chances. It was the kiss of two lonely souls finding a home in each other. In that moment, Cassidy knew she would never leave. This black, scarred piece of earth was her home. This broken, beautiful man was her home. They began to rebuild. Jed rode to the next county, a 2-day journey, and came back with a wagon full of lumber and supplies. He'd used the money from the strongbox, the money his father had left him. The first thing they built wasn't a house or a barn. It was a small, simple fence around a patch of ground on a low hill overlooking the valley. Inside it, Jed hammered 2 simple wooden crosses into the earth. For Maria and Lily. It was the first time Cassidy had ever seen him cry without shame. Slowly, like the first green shoots pushing through the ash, the ranch came back to life. A new house rose, smaller than the first, but sturdy. A new barn took shape, its fresh pine scent a promise of the future. The townsfolk from Coyote Bluff, hearing what had happened, rode out one day. It wasn't the sheriff who had reportedly fled the territory. It was a small group of them, their faces etched with shame. They offered to help, bringing supplies and food. "We were wrong," one of the women who had once mocked Cassidy said, her eyes downcast. "We let jealousy and fear make us cruel. We're sorry." Jed and Cassidy accepted their help, not with anger, but with a quiet grace. Forgiveness, like the land, took time to heal. One spring morning, a year after the fire, Cassidy woke to the sound of birdsong. The prairie was no longer black, but a vibrant, impossible green. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in splashes of yellow and blue. She walked out onto the porch of their new home, a cup of coffee in her hand. Jed was already up, mending a saddle on the porch rail. He looked up and smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. The scar on his temple was just a faint silver line now, a part of the story of who he was. "Mornin'," he said. "Mornin'," she replied, leaning against him. He put his arm around her, and they stood there, watching the sun rise over their land. The white mare, Lily's horse, grazed peacefully in the new corral. The Broken Star Ranch was whole again. Later that day, a lone rider approached. It was a circuit judge making his rounds. He brought news. Caleb had been found dead in the Badlands, a victim of the very wilderness he had tried to master. There was no triumph in the news, only a quiet, somber end to a sad story. The judge also brought them a letter. It was from Elara, Jed's first wife. She had heard of the fire, of his loss. She wrote that she had never stopped thinking of him, that leaving had been the biggest mistake of her life. She was asking if she could come back. Cassidy's heart clenched. She looked at Jed, searching his face. He read the letter, his expression unreadable. Then he folded it carefully, walked over to the cook fire, and dropped it in. He watched it burn to ash before turning back to Cassidy. He walked over to her, took her face in his hands, and said, "My life is here. My home is here. With you." They were married by that same circuit judge a week later, standing on the hill beside the 2 wooden crosses. Cassidy wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself, and in her hair she wore a single white wildflower. She was no longer the ugly stray. She was the woman who had faced down fire and hate and had chosen to build a life from the ashes. She was Cassidy Mallister, the Iron Rancher's wife. And as she looked at her husband, she knew that true beauty wasn't something you saw with your eyes. It was something you built with your hands, something you defended with your heart. It was the strength to rise from the ruins, again and again, and choose to grow. If you believe that courage is more beautiful than any face, and that home is a thing you build, not a place you find, then don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You never know what other hidden stories are waiting to be uncovered.